Look, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do here is make the point. I'm a little bit at risk of belabouring it, that there are lots of different types of transactions that are done for lots of different reasons. Over the course of this subject, we're going to look at lots of different kinds and understand. A bit more of that terminology goes to these kind of... So we tend to think about transactions when we're thinking about them in the market as being vertical or downstream transactions, or upstream for that matter, horizontal and diagonal. I've never actually heard people talk about diagonal transactions in the market, but it's in all the literature. So I am going to talk to you about it. You've never heard it, so we'll have a look at each of them. So a vertical transaction is literally one where you've got a purchase of a supplier, so an upstream transaction, or the purchase of a customer, a downstream transaction. And an example that we could give here, some of these are a little bit old, things like when IOOF purchased...
Purchase from customer is a downstream?
A purchase of a customer or of a part of the distribution channel, for example. So if I were a robot manufacturer and I sell my robots to you, I sell them, you're my key distributor for Southeast Asia, and you then sell them to robot shops all over the place. By acquiring your business, I have now brought in-house my distribution train. That would be downstream. So you're technically a customer. You're probably not the end user, but you're technically a customer. But upstream would be you purchasing me, so to speak. Examples here, IOOF purchasing a range of different financial services firms. We got some other terminology which I'm, not as wedded to either. So sometimes we talk about roll-up or bolt-on, similar sort of things to vertical, but from a slightly different perspective, often involving multiple transactions as we basically roll up a whole lot of different things into one. So whether that's rolling up a whole lot of suppliers to make one chain or rolling up distributors all over the place. Good example of that is large franchise operators. So McDonald's quite often will do that. McDonald's franchises are very expensive. So if you think about a franchisee as being a customer of the McDonald's franchisor chain, then they have their own stores, but then they might particularly, I think they did this in France where they weren't doing as well. They rolled up a whole lot. They purchased a whole lot of franchises, got the model working the way they wanted it before they then pushed them out again. I think we also have Tuckin there. What are we talking about here? This is often... it's really just when the deal is structured so that instead of just acquiring something and putting it in a subsidiary, where you're actually just acquiring often as a business, where you're tucking in the kinds of expertise that you need into your own business. Gets a bit ridiculous, really, some of the terminology.
So sorry, Kath, is that to suggest that there's no subsidiary as a result? It's just one...
if they've done it that way, they can do it that way. So it's often that, like we were talking about at the beginning, the choice can be, and we'll talk about the reasons for it, between acquiring shares or acquiring a business. So a tuck-in transaction would often be acquiring the business. So you might still have subsidiaries that do other things, but what you do is you purchase, say, the intellectual property, the assets, you get the transfer of some employees into one of your subsidiaries to do something in particular. I've also seen a couple of what you would call tuck-in transactions where some companies who use legal advice, specialist legal advice, Telstra has done this a couple of times, where they have effectively bought a practice group from within a law firm and they've brought that in-house for specialist expertise, in part because, and that was strategic, because I think it possibly would have cost them more money, but what they're trying to do is make sure that their competitors didn't get the value of the learning, the specialist learning that those lawyers did in a particularly nuanced niche place. Of course, the thing that most of you will well and truly know about employees is when you own you can't own a person, and it's very hard to restrain their trade.
Like when a purchaser of a business says we need to lock in the employee as part of this acquisition, and we turn around to say, well, good luck with that. Because, put them on whatever contract they would you like. Look out for it.
Another thing that's happening more and more here is this again. This is a little bit old. This is end of last year. It's not that bad. Is large companies that are actually setting up their own venture funds to look for strategic, disruptive investments. So Westpac, a bank, it's given now more than $150 million to a company called Reinventure to manage. So that Reinventure is well, it's not a subsidiary, technically a subsidiary of Westpac, but it may as well be. It manages some money, 150 million, not a huge amount, but enough. And the investment mandate is to go out and find businesses that might compete with us in the future, so that we can invest. They're not buying them outright, they're taking small pieces, but partly to learn, partly to make sure that they don't get left behind. I think partly so that they can look cool in co-working spaces as well. Okay, horizontal transaction, good example here. I mean, basically at the end of the day, horizontal transactions are about acquiring competitors. Diagonal, like I said, I've never actually seen this, but in theory, a diagonal transaction is about making a purchase into a new market and then partnering somewhere else. So the example that's usually used is film studios partnering with video gaming, joint venture transactions involving brand recognition across different industries. Google has been doing quite a lot in the GPS space recently. So really sort of going completely, it's not in an industry that you're dealing with, it's across generally. So we can classify M&A in those ways. And when we're talking about the type of transaction, it's good language to use. I think another way to look at it is to think about it from the point of view of business strategy, corporate strategy, or whether in fact the company itself is a financial conglomerate or a financial entity. So a good example of a conglomerate in that sense is a company like Wesfarmers. So Wesfarmers, basically its mission is to buy businesses, build them and sell them. If you look at Wesfarmers' annual report or its website, it'll effectively say all of our assets are for sale. If we can get more cash for them by somebody else owning them, we will sell them. And they don't have any particular coherent, it's not like they just invest in retail or just invest in mining or just invest in agriculture. They go across, they're effectively a listed PE company in some ways. It's a listed equity company. So basically, the investments they make are unrelated and they're opportunistic. If they get the ability to buy something that they think they can sell later for more money, that is what they will do. And many PE enterprises work the same way. So yeah, corporate and business strategy sort of match with that horizontal and vertical strategy. And it is worth remembering that for every purchase there's a sale, and for every slide I put like that I meant to come back and add a picture and forgot. So for Deloitte have basically, this is research that's come from Deloitte, for almost 70% of M&A leaders that they surveyed in their last global survey said that they were preparing to sell something at the moment. So again, we're looking possibly at a time for the M&A market to breathe in. Key motivator for considering a divestment is that the asset is not a core part of the business. So a key motivator for buying things over the recent time has been we want to make sure that we've got a diversified portfolio and that we're investing in things that might disrupt us. But when it gets too far from our core business and we see our shareholders getting skittish, then we bring it back in a little bit. So market conditions change things. So again, if this were a design thinking class, I would talk about this idea of a wicked problem. Wicked problems are, again, it's an academic term. You hear it from time to time. It actually comes out of town planning, believe it or not. But the idea of a wicked problem is a complex problem that, amongst other things, that anything you do to try and solve it will change the nature of the problem itself. So markets are, as much as economists would like to say, you know, we've got demand and supply and we do this and that, the thing is people are irrational and people make choices at any given point, and choices can change the way that things happen. So if you are looking at earnings per share as your valuation, as the market is going down, you can actually be achieving a great deal, because as your share price goes down, if your earnings are consistent, then that will usually mean that your earnings as a percentage of your share price have gone up. Should be good news. But the market doesn't like to see share prices go down. So again, balancing earnings per share and continual growth in share price is this kind of wicked, manipulative Rubik's Cube of a problem that people in this area are trying to deal with. Again, at risk of, we can go on with the different types of classification. I'm not even going to continue here because we are going to not even get to what I wanted to get to yet. So let's start to talk about the types of transactions that we're going to be talking about. Interestingly, this data is from the ATO, who say that the two most common mechanisms for affecting M&A transactions are schemes of arrangement, so where shareholders of a company effectively vote to merge with another company, or an off-market takeover. Now, an off-market takeover, if we count the companies, if we go back to that picture that I showed you a little while ago, most of those transactions in the green would be technically off-market takeovers, because there will be an acquirer of another entity. The stock exchange won't be involved because none of the companies in 90% of those transactions will be listed. Maybe not 90%, but in a significant majority of those transactions. So technically, yes, it's an off-market transfer or takeover, but it's effectively the acquisition by one company of another in a private space, usually involving the consent or the agreement of the shareholders. Other types of ways that transactions can be effective include the sorts of things that we'll talk about in the second weekend. So things like share, and actually we'll talk about schemes in that time too. So we'll talk about, I think you'll have to go under the table, Harry, sorry. We'll talk about capital reductions, share buybacks, issuing new shares, which is where we're going to spend a lot of our time tomorrow, and contracts of sale, so which is, again, part of what we'll do in the second weekend. So we've spoken a lot about M&A transactions. Well, we've got to 3/4 of the way through the day, practically. We've talked a lot about different kinds of M&A transactions without really honing into which are the bits that the lawyers do, and which is where we're going to be spending really the rest of our time. And so lawyers are ultimately involved in, usually as part of a team with the tax and the finance people, structuring the transaction. We're involved in identifying the laws that apply, not only to the transaction, but to the types of businesses that are being done and that are being affected by the transaction. We do the due diligence, and ultimately we create the noun, as I like to call it. We're the ones who are documenting the deal as it stands. So most of what I've been talking about over the last little while, has been about this, identifying and value. That's actually, most of that is usually happening before the lawyers even get involved. So we are often playing catch up in that space, and often we are trying to work out the why of the deal. Again, those of you, the two Michaels actually, might like to comment on this, but one of the things that I have found difficult in the past is, so one of the benefits of doing this type of work is you do a lot of it, right? So you see a lot of deals, you get a sense commercially of what is working and what isn't working and why people might do it. And sometimes we're getting to this stage here where we're negotiating key terms and you're thinking, this deal doesn't make sense to me. Why are they doing this deal? And there is nothing that makes a client more cranky, particularly one who wants to do a deal, right, than the lawyer who is not the numbers person, who hasn't had the background in the value and the identification of the deal to start off with, asking them questions about the deal.
I think it depends on making sure you don't cross the line, if you're a lawyer, crossing the line of commercial negotiation. And that to me is the line. So my view, my personal view is the lawyers...
I agree with your view.
The lawyers that we work with the best and that, we find we have successful transactions with are those that understand that delineation. It's when they try and become involved in the commercial negotiation rather than the structuring of the actual contract and the contractual terms. So that people start tripping over themselves.
Yeah, and it can be very difficult to actually see where the line is between legal advice and commercial advice. And our ethical obligations, how many of you have done the ethics subject, or what is it, professional management? Only one so far. So again, I'm going to bore you a little bit here, but one of the key ethical duties that lawyers have is to act in the best interest of their client. But the unwritten rules in that is to act as a lawyer in the best interest of your client. But you need to balance that. If you know or see something that your client can't see, there is a skill and an art to communicating that and to raising the question in the right way. The reason I mentioned that story earlier about my young German associate who kept putting his foot in it, is actually that is part of the art of learning how to do this, is working out when to ask the questions in the meeting and when to take those questions offline. The complicating question is usually the lawyer will be the most expensive professional in the room other than the corporate advisor, but the corporate advisor, most of their fee is at risk. So by at risk, I mean that they will effectively receive a success fee. So the deal goes through, they will get a percentage based on a range of different things. It is usually the biggest chunk overall, but if the deal doesn't go through, they don't get paid. That can, at times, affect their approach to wanting to get the deal through, right? You as the lawyer, it is now technically possible in some ways for corporate transaction lawyers to receive success fees in relation to deals, but there's a ethics and compliance minefield around doing that. But on the whole, as lawyers, we are getting paid, ideally. We're sending a bill anyway, whether the deal goes through or not. We are probably charging a higher number than any of the other advisors in the room. And so when we are seen as slowing down the process by asking questions that have already been resolved, that can end up being quite an unpleasant part of the act of negotiating effectively, or the act of dealing with the client. So particularly when you're coming into these transactions as a junior person, one of the things you guys are going to need to be able to do is learn that managing up. Because the thing is, going back to the Emperor's New Clothes idea, there is no such thing as a stupid question, right? But there can be a stupid time to ask it.
I find this normally comes up around risk assessment.
Often.
So, from a legal advice point of view, this part of this transaction is highly risky to our client because it may involve an earn-out or something along those lines. Whereas we may be sitting there saying that we understand that there is no transaction, but that risk component is not in there, and the client wants to pursue the transaction. From a commercial point of view, these are the terms. And then it's the client's call. And so everyone can give their piece of advice, as long as it doesn't become a case of the solicitor saying, don't go ahead with this deal unless we carve this out, because we'll say, okay, you've just blown up the entire deal. So that's the...
No, look, and I know myself, I've blown up deals. Blown up more than I care to mention, actually. I'm actually quite happy with that because I'm pretty sure there was ill advice that was getting there. And often, particularly the space that I advise in is at the very small cap space where financing is expensive. So if you're getting $1 million investment and it's going to cost you 15% of that, so you're not getting $1 million, you're getting $850,000, you're paying $150,000 to the people who brought the money in, and and particularly if you are a small cap and you are new to this and you haven't done it before, when the pricing and the flow on terms don't make sense, it is, in my view, my job to make sure that my client truly understands the deal that they're doing. Again, and I might be speaking for my industry, but I have seen this a lot in across the board, is executives who look after M&A transactions in their organisations are rarely the first one to walk into a room and say, I've got no idea what's going on here. Often the personality traits that you need in order to walk them through. So, and I'm happy to be paid well to be the bad guy. So, and it's about getting that balance right, but it can be very difficult as a junior lawyer to work out how to do it. And often that is, all right, I recognise this might be overkill and everybody understands this, but I'm just going to step out in absolute detail to make sure I've understood correctly. It's embarrassing that I'm going to be so slow, but you're going to get this amount of money, you're going to pay him $1.5 million for it, then you're going to have to report on these covenants every time, and you're not sure that you can actually deliver, and then on the end you're going to give them 75% of your company, which you got an offer to sell the whole thing for a couple of weeks ago for $4 million. That's not actually making sense to me. What am I missing? And often, I just made up those numbers as I went. It may not have made any sense, but if you can see how actually a large part of what we're doing is walking people through that process. Now, a good commercial advisor will do that too, but sometimes, and particularly at the bottom end of the market, which is often where the large firms will send junior lawyers to practice, right? Because that's where you learn. You get to do more of it on a smaller, less expensive transaction where, the client can't afford to spend as much money, but you can learn from it. That's often where it happens. So thinking through, remembering there are people here, and people don't always tell you the truth. If you ask them, do they understand? Maybe they do. Maybe they think they understand. Maybe they don't. People will very rarely say that sort of thing. So where do we work? We often work in the negotiation. Again, and Michael makes a really good point here, we negotiate, we often go backwards and forwards on the words, but not the content of the terms. So we will advise on what the impact of having or not having a particular clause in an agreement will be, but it is very rarely the place of the lawyer to negotiate the actual numbers that are involved or the timelines. We can, and we often do, say, in the last 50 of these transactions, I've seen a 60-day period for this. So we have a sense of what's commercially usual, if we do. But ultimately, it's up to our clients to identify what the commercial terms are.
You have to understand, I'll just say that to that.
Please.
You have to have some understanding of what you're looking at as well, not in terms of the content. So it's not your role to negotiate it.
Yeah.
You still got to kind of understand it.
Which is, and look, and this is, as pretty as it is to put them out in this general sort of order, actually we go backwards and forwards all the time. So the due diligence gives us that opportunity to understand, to verify, to check, and to see where the issues arise. We then ultimately, so due diligence, we're also not the only ones doing the due diligence. Usually there will be somebody doing financial due diligence. There might be technical due diligence. So if, for example, this involves a mining company, it's almost inevitable that we will have a geologist involved and probably engineers as well. If it's a technology company, we'll probably have a technology specialist in the relevant area. So looking at the, we might have HR and industrial relations experts, a range of, so subject matter experts will look at different areas. Yep.
The risk that there could be an adjustment in future years based on
things that have happened in the past. Absolutely. So legal, so there's a lot, and Carly makes a good point here. So there will be lots of things that sit, and what I'll do is I'll show you a standard kind of due diligence report when we get there, but you'll see the lawyers will be responsible for a whole lot of things, but they will need to draw on different experts for even the content of that. So usually the legal will look at material contracts. They will look at the employment and industrial relations issues, but from a change management and HR publicity, that will be dealt with by a separate expert. Tax, the tax will be from both a ATO and relevant stamp duty perspectives. There will be some financial analysis in there, but there will also be that risk analysis of where that's going next. Often sits under legal, but is often actually done by the accounting firm. And then the accounting, you're trying to get to closing, and the accounting firm and the law firm are fighting with each other about what mutual sign-ups are going to be given, because at the end of the day, all of our clients want everything in one page. We do the one page, we back it up with 50 pages that are basically about covering our asses, because that's how it works. So the documentation piece then drives from the negotiation and the due diligence, both go into the documentation. Regardless of the type of transaction structure, whether we're issuing a disclosure document or if it is a sale and purchase agreement of some sort, we're taking the information from that due diligence in order to identify and document what risks are involved. So due diligence is often done by exception. So in other words, we do all of this investigation, we learn all of these things, but we pretty much limit the reports that we make to the bad stuff, the problematic stuff, which I think in a way has its own problems. And I'm kind of looking forward to the day when we get some more automated stuff out of due diligence rooms that show good things and opportunities for synergies and learning. Sorry, what was that? Yeah. Everybody, we love a traffic light. It's one of the only places where lawyers get to use colours in their reports.
I was just going to say it's often used as a tool for renegotiation because we move back and forth as well.
Well, for identifying, so it will go back into the negotiations. So it's not done till it's all done. If you want this price, you are going to need to give us some indemnities in relation to this risk. Or you're going to need to fix this before we take over if you want the deal to be done in this amount of time. Remember, when you negotiate, price is rarely the most interesting factor to negotiate on. There are all sorts of different levers you can pull. Time, what the content is, who the people are, a whole range of different things. So that all leads into the documentation and ultimately to completion. So completion, again, a bit of jargon. Lawyers will use this term completion or closing quite a lot. It's the time when the lawyers issue an invoice and drink champagne and everybody else gets on with the hard work of actually living with whatever deal this is that we have created at this point in time. And so often completion is a big part. Like in the 80s, it used to be quite ceremonious, actually. I think we've sort of lost the art of the, sitting around a boardroom and having all of the documents and, the final signatures and everything being checked. Yeah, we did. Well, I think I've told my contract people this. We used to, especially when you had really complex paper documents where things were typed on, well, I'm not that old, but we didn't have typewriters. We used word processing machines, which are quite different from computers. We used to always have deal names that matched the number of letters in the name of each of the clients. So you're keeping things a secret. So if you had party A and party B, so what party -A, that's 8 characters, is it? So 7, 8 characters. We would have to find a code word that matched the number of characters so that you could do a global replace of that word all the way through on, like all those things to just keep it all secret. Everything would be printed out and checked. The day before, junior people from each side would be in there page by page, checking that all the documents are the same. Nobody had sneakily thrown in something extra. And then it would all be sat there, and then sort of middle-level executives would come in and sign all of the annexures and the bits at the end. And then we'd put those all into a box. We'd put ribbons around the box and seal them in with marks so you could see if, this package has been tampered with, do not purchase. And then, the big wigs would come in the next day. And again, think about contract. Offer, acceptance. The person who accepts is the one with the power, right? Because until an offer is accepted, we don't have a contract. So you'd have these identical contracts there, and they'd have their pens, and it would be like almost 1, 2, 3. So they both sign at the same time. So we didn't have an acceptance, and didn't have any of that messing around just in case. And, these days we just bloody swap PDFs over a computer. It's really not nearly as much fun. We'd go through all the board meetings and stuff, and yeah. But a lot of the processes that we do now come from actually, it's possibly too big a word to call it the ceremony, but because a lot of these things that are being automated now were done by people for a very long time. On the day of the transactions, I used to have to run down to the stock exchange and actually go to the floor to see if there'd been any spike or any change in the trading price, because often a condition precedent to a deal would involve whether or not there'd been a material change in price. Of course, that wasn't automated in the 80s, so that's what job I had when I was at law school. That's when they used to have people with chalk actually doing the calculations in their head, like human computers. So, yes, I know I'm not keeping time. Go away. This must be very annoying on the computer. Come on, change. There we go. So, lots of common law stuff comes in these transactions, but we do have some pretty significant legislation that is going to be relevant across the board in this subject. Corporations Act will not surprise any of you. Chapters 6 and 7 in particular. I love the way they call them chapters. It makes it sound like, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that, if you skim through to the end, you'll be able to work it out. Doesn't really work like that. You can't really read them like chapters in a book. The Foreign Acquisitions and Takeovers Act. Won't spend a lot of time on it, but it can be significantly relevant to these kind of transactions. So that's the law that states what the limits are on foreign investments being made in Australia. It looks at a couple of different things, depending on where you are from. So Americans and New Zealanders in particular, they can invest a lot more money in Australia than people from China or Europe before there's any regulation applies. And it's where you're from, but it can also be what kind of asset. So acquisitions of land, the monetary thresholds are much lower than acquisitions of other things. There are certain enterprises and types of businesses that are deemed to be important to our economy and to Australia's strategic approach to globalization, I guess, where there'll be impact if foreigners seek to invest. They include banking, not surprisingly the stock exchange. Some of you might remember a few years ago the Singapore Stock Exchange made a takeover bid for the Australian Stock Exchange. The ASX board were all in favour of it. They saw it part of making a regionalised Southeast Asian approach, but because of the nature of the and the size of the transaction and the nature of the business, it needed to be addressed by the Treasurer, and the policy decision was no, that Australia should have its own stock exchange that is majority owned by Australian investors. Competition and Consumer Act, the CCA, in particular Section 50, but basically the merger provisions. So the Competition and Consumer Act, well, it has competition and consumer in it. The opening paragraph of that legislation from memory talks about how this is an act to protect competition and consumers and the Australian economy. So it is not an act that protects people from their competitors. So competitor there used as a noun, it protects competition. So the economic concept that economies work better when there is competition is basically what sits behind that act. So that act will require investigations into, and in some cases approval of, transactions that could substantially affect competition in a market. The way that those provisions work change about every 10 years. So the most recent inquiry was the Harper inquiry, which recommended a number of changes to how the competition provisions work, some of which have been enacted, some of which have not. I've added in the ASX listing rules there as a source of regulation. The listing rules aren't really regulations though. The listing rules are effectively a contractual arrangement between the ASX as the provider of a platform on which shares can be traded and members of what is called the official list. So again, we'll come back to this. I know I'm going backwards and forwards, but I'm trying to give you the big overview so we've got some common language here. But members of the stock exchange, so when you do an IPO, you effectively apply to become a member of the official list. And companies that are on the official list, or shares in companies that are on the official list, can be traded on the platform. And in order to become a member of the official list, you enter into a contract with the ASX and you agree to comply with a number of things, including the listing rules. So there are also brokers or trading rules that work about how the platform itself works. But the listing rules include a number of things. We've already spoken about Chapter 3, which is the set of obligations around continuous disclosure. So now they mirror in some part what are called the continuous disclosure rules that sit in the Corporations Act. But effectively what the government has agreed with the ASX is that as ASX is the platform on which these shares are traded, that is the natural place for continuous or disclosures to be made by companies that are listed to the market. So ASIC has effectively delegated its powers in relation to all but one company to ASX to basically collect and distribute continuous disclosure information. The one company that sits outside of that is the ASX itself. So ASIC actually performs its own review in relation to continuous disclosure for the ASX company. And then, of course, if we're doing any of these transactions, they're going to be relevant industry or industry type regulation. So if we are buying or selling businesses and moving employees from one place to another, the employment law is going to be relevant. If we are buying and selling businesses that own intellectual property assets, then intellectual property rules are going to be relevant. If we are buying and selling businesses that perform financial services transactions, then financial services or banking regulation is going to be relevant. Transport regulation, building regulations, depending on your industry. So the regulators themselves follow through from that. Really, in a sense, it should be pretty obvious where these ones come from. So we've got, ASIC, for the large part, regulates the Corporations Act. The corporations or the takeover provisions, instead, it's a quasi-regulation act, but are regulated by the Takeovers Panel. Now, I don't have confirmation, but I'm hoping that we will have somebody from the Takeovers Panel come and speak with us the next weekend that we're together. The Foreign Investment Review Board, universally referred to as FIRB, it regulates the Foreign Acquisitions and Takeovers Act. ACCC and ASX, I think you'll be familiar with, and clearly depends on the industry as to what the industry regulators are. What's the point here, Kath? The point is that we have complexity. So often as lawyers, we're dealing with a number of different stakeholders from a regulatory perspective as well. So they're the key points that I wanted to make in relation to that. I want to do